Dear students, good afternoon. I hope you all are well and safe in this pandemic. Anyway, I am Subhash Chandra Shankar, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Government, Rajendra College. I would like to welcome you to my online class on Aristotle's Poetics. Dear students, in your honors third year, you have a course named Introduction to Critical Theory up to Romantic period, or you better say Introduction to Literary Criticism. So, in this course, you have five major critical texts up to Romantic period. The first one is Aristotle's Poetics. The second one is Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. The third one is Dr. Samuel Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare. The fourth one is William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballad. And the final one is Samuel Taylor Coleridge Biographia Literaria. And you should know you have a course in your honors fourth year. When you will be in your honors fourth year, the name of that course is Literary Criticism. So this course is more or less important for you. So dear students, now let us get ready for our today's discussion. You know, you have the subject or you have the text Aristotle's Poetics, but you need not read the whole text. Rather, you have to read from chapter 1 to chapter 14 and then chapter 24 and finally chapter 26. But for your better convenience or for your better understanding, I rather suggest you to read the whole text. The text is not that much big or that much difficult, and one thing you should know, you are not going to read the original Greek text written by Aristotle. Rather, you are reading the text Poetics in English translation. So this text is not that much difficult. You just have a look of the text. The text is very simple, and the text, if you consider the size is not that much big. So it's a very easy type of book. So I hope you will read the text. Well, so dear student, let us get ready for our today's discussion. So first we will start with Aristotle, then we will concentrate on Aristotle's Poetics. I hope you all have heard the name of Aristotle. Aristotle was basically a Greek philosopher and polymath during the classical period in ancient Greece. He was born in 384 BC and he died in 322 BC. He was a student of the great Greek philosopher Plato, and Aristotle was the founder of Lyceum. Lyceum was the peripatetic school of philosophy, and he was the innovator of Aristotelian tradition. So you just simply find that Aristotle has exerted a unique influence on almost every form of knowledge in the Western civilization as well as in the world civilization, and he still continues to be a subject of contemporaneity. So the relevance of Aristotle is still felt in our today's world. So this is Aristotle. You better have an idea about Aristotle. So now let us get ready for poetics. So first, the thing that you have to remember, the word poetics and the text poetics. So now first let us have a look on the text poetics. So poetics is written by Aristotle, no doubt, and Aristotle Poetics is considered the most influential and widely debated work of aesthetics within the history of literature and theatrical perception or theater. Poetics is the earliest surviving work of dramatic theory, and it is the first extant philosophical treatise to focus on literary theory. And Aristotle Poetics is today famous for Aristotle's analysis of tragedy. And in fact, Aristotle's analysis of tragedy constitutes the core of poetics. So now let us get ready for the major portion in the text, poetics. But before moving to the text, let us consider the word poetics. So, what does the word poetics mean? So, according to Aristotle, poetics is the art of poetry. And you should concentrate on one thing, that Aristotle did not use the word poetry in our contextual meaning of today's world. Rather, Aristotle used the word poetry in a broader sense, and his poetry is almost all inclusive. All inclusive means poetry is also, you better say, it is epic poetry, it is tragedy, it is comedy, it is dithyrambic. Dithyrambic poem is a kind of passionate hymn in praise of Greek god Dionysus, or even it may be different kinds of music. So Aristotle's use of the word poetry is almost today's literature. So, what did Aristotle do in his text Poetics? So, Aristotle offers an account of the art of poetry. Poetry means literature, and examines literature's first principle and identifies its genres and basic element. So, one thing you should know, the text Poetics did not begin the history of literary criticism. So, if you consider the name Homer or Hesiod, then you will get the idea that for Homer, the function of literature is to give pleasure, and for Hesiod is to give instruction. And when it comes to the time of Aristotle, so the function of poetry, or in a broader sense, literature, is to give delight and information. So, in poetics, Aristotle tries to give an idea about the basic principles of literature, as well as the classification and basic elements of literature in Aristotle's word poetry. Well, so dear students, in poetics you will get 26 chapter, and this 26th chapter is preceded by a short introduction. If you go through the main text or the original text, then you will find an introduction, and then you will get 26 chapter. The chapter is not that much larger or that much big. Rather, the chapters, you will find the chapter is a bit small in proportion or in size. Well, so Aristotle begins his poetics with an introduction. So when Aristotle opens poetics, he tries to define poetry as mimesis. Well, so the word mimesis is actually a Greek word, and this word is not the invention of Aristotle. Rather, this word mimesis was first used by Aristotle's teacher Plato. And for Plato, mimesis is imitation or representation or presentation. But for Plato, this mimesis is a bit different from Aristotle. So, according to Plato, mimesis is the imitation of art, or Plato believes that art is merely an imitation or an illusion, but according to Aristotle, mimesis is something more. So according to Aristotle, mimesis is imitation of man in action. So if we consider Aristotle's conception of mimesis, then we will find that according to Aristotle, mimesis is representation or imitation of art or imitation of man in action, and this imitation or this poetic imitation is carried on the ground of three things. One is medium, another one is object, and the final one is manner. Well, so Aristotle's poetics seeks to address the different kinds of poetry, that means literature, the structure of a good poem, and the division of a poem into its component parts. Component parts mean constituents part. He defines poetry as a medium of imitation that seeks to represent or duplicate life through character, emotion, or action. That's why Aristotle defines poetry very broadly, not narrowly. So, according to Aristotle, poetry is epic poetry, or poetry is tragedy, or poetry is comedy, or poetry is dithyrambic poetry, or even poetry may be different kinds of music. So Aristotle in his introduction just tries to present the idea of mimesis or imitation. Well, so now let us go through the next analysis. So, Aristotle's analysis of tragedy constitutes the core of poetics. And in chapter 6, or you better say the chapter 6 is the most important portion in poetics. So, in chapter 6, if we go through the text, then we will find the name of the chapter 6 is, or the title of the chapter 6 is a description of tragedy. So, in this chapter, Aristotle first tries to define tragedy, and then he shows the six constituent parts of a tragedy. So, in the history of critical theory or in the history of literary criticism, Aristotle's chapter 6 or a description of poetry is very important. So, in the first portion, Aristotle tries to define poetry, and according to Aristotle, a tragedy is a representation of an action. Just consider the word representation of an action, not narration. That is worth serious attention. That means the action is not light or jovial, rather it is serious. Okay, then the action should be complete in itself. It is complete in itself means that it must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay, and that action must be of some magnitude or amplitude in language enriched by a variety of artistic device appropriate to the several parts of the play. So tragedy is not a representation of action which is not serious. So the language that we should use in a tragedy should be enriched, and it should be embellished with artistic device. Well, then comes presented in the form of action, not narration. That means according to Aristotle, a tragedy is simply a representation of an action. A tragedy is not an epic. That's why a tragedy should not narrate, rather, it should act well and accomplishing by means of pity and fear, bringing about the catharsis of such emotion. So, just concentrate on the terms pity and fear, and then catharsis. Okay, what is pity and what is fear? So, when a common audience or a common spectator watches a tragedy, he feels pity for the downfall of the tragic hero, and he feels fear for the downfall of the tragic hero for himself or herself, and these things brings about a catharsis or purgation or purification of emotion. So Aristotle's definition of tragedy is a bit lengthy, so just concentrate on the definition. The definition has several portions. The first portion, that tragedy is a representation of an action. Obviously, the action is serious, complete, and of magnitude. Then it should have enriched language and it should have artistic device. Then it should be definitely presented in the form of action, not narration, and it must arise or arouse the feeling of pity and fear among the audience and bringing about the emotion of catharsis. Well, so this is the definition given by Aristotle. Okay, after providing the definition of tragedy, Aristotle's go to the, you better say, Aristotle goes to the constituent parts of a tragedy. And according to Aristotle, a tragedy has six constituent parts. The first one is plot, the second one is character, the third one is diction or language, then comes melody or music, or you better say chorus, and finally comes spectacle. So these are the six constituent parts of a tragedy. If a playwright or a dramatist wishes to compose a tragedy, the tragedy must include these six constituent parts. The first one is plot. Plot means a tragedy is definitely a tragic story. So, plot is the ordering of the incident. Then, the incident is not a narration, rather, it is an action. So, the action of the tragedy will be reflected through the character, and thought is the reflection of the dramatist or the moral purpose of the dramatist. You better say it is the property of the tragedy in which the dramatist or the playwright will explore the possibility or the law of probability. And then comes diction or language, that means the expressive use of words. Well, then comes chorus or music or melody. According to Aristotle, these things is also important for a tragedy, particularly for Greek tragedy. And the final one is spectacle. But spectacle is not related that much with the playwright, rather it related with the performance. Spectacle is stage effect. What stage effect will be applied in the performance of the tragedy. So, in this chapter 6, we find the definition of tragedy and then the six constituent parts of a tragedy. Well, so after that, if we go a bit deeper, then just we will go to the chapter 7, and the title of the chapter 7 is the scope of the plot, and the title of the chapter 8 is unity of plot. So let us discuss the two chapters together, the scope and unity of the plot in a tragedy. So we have already said a plot in a tragedy is the ordering of the incident. Obviously, the incident should be tragic. Well, so the plot is the lifeblood of tragedy. If there is no plot, no tragedy is possible. So it is the soul of a tragedy. It is the first essential of tragedy. And according to Aristotle, a plot must have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it must also be universal in significance and have a determinate structure. Well, a plot must maintain a unity of theme and purpose. It must be complete whole. That means a tragedy should concentrate on a single theme, and it should be complete. Complete in the sense that it, when a common audience will complete watching the tragedy, he will have a complete idea when and should have logical coherence. That means the ordering of the incident should be logical. And finally, a plot must contain elements of reversal, discovery, and catastrophe. So, in your understanding of a tragedy, these three terms are very important. And in chapter 11, you will get a discussion on reversal, discovery, and catastrophe. Well, so let us go to the next discussion. If we go to the next discussion, that means the discussion on reversal, discovery, and catastrophe. So, what does Aristotle mean by reversal or discovery or catastrophe? So, according to Aristotle, a reversal is a change from one state of affairs to its opposite, usually from happiness to misery. So, reversal is an ironic twist or change by which the main action of the tragic story come full circles. Well, so reversal is the first component of a complex, or you better say on a good plot. Then comes discovery. So what is discovery? Discovery is the change from ignorance to knowledge, and it leads either to love or to hatred between persons destined for good or ill fortune. Definitely a tragedy will lead one to ill fortune. So, discovery is the change from ignorance to knowledge, usually involving people coming to understand one another's true identities. In this context, Aristotle gives the reference of Sophocles' Oedipus. When the tragedy Oedipus opens, everybody knows the identity of Oedipus, but the problem is that Oedipus himself does not know his true identity. So, the discovery of Oedipus' true identity is the thing, the recognition that brings the change from ignorance to knowledge. When the final thing is a calamity or catastrophe, or you can call it suffering. So, calamity or catastrophe is a destructive or painful action, or better you can say a calamity is an action of a destructive or painful nature. It may be death openly represented, or excessive suffering, or wounding, or the like. So catastrophe is often the result of a reversal or recognition. So tragedy is something that is not about happiness, rather it is about sorrow or about misery. That's why it is the result of a reversal or recognition. So all three elements coalesce to create catharsis. So we have already mentioned the term catharsis, which is the engenderment of fear and pity in the audience. Well, so pity for the tragic hero's plight and fear that his fate, it means the audience fate, might befall on him or on her. So these three things, reversal, discovery, and catastrophe, are the three major portions of a good plot. Well, so after that, let us go to another important thing, that is in chapter 15. Although this chapter is not included in your national university syllabus, but this chapter is also important, and we usually find questions coming from this chapter. So we should have an idea on this particular chapter. The chapter 15 is titled The Characters of Tragedy. So in this chapter, we find Aristotle's idea of a tragic hero. So hero, that means protagonist. He may be a hero or may be a heroine. So according to Aristotle, or as regarding the character in tragedy, Aristotle says that the, the playwright should aim at four things, or you can say Aristotle suggests the playwright to aim at four things. So, what are the things that a playwright needs to aim? The first is, or firstly, the hero must be good and thus manifest moral purpose in his piece. That means the ideal tragic hero should be neither too good nor too bad, but his inclination must be towards goodness, not towards evil or badness. When the second one is the hero must have propriety or manly value. That means the hero should be appropriate. Well, thirdly, the hero must be true to life. That means what is possible to life is reflected in the character of the tragic hero. And finally, the hero must be consistent. That means there should be consistency in the story or plot of the tragedy, and definitely with the character of the tragic hero. So, in general, the ideal tragic hero should be neither too good nor too bad. He should be the intermediate kind of personage. That means he is the mixture of goodness and evil or badness, one not preeminently virtuous, and just whose misfortune is brought about by hamartia. So, hamartia is tragic flaw, or you can call it hubris, that is miscalculation or an error of judgment. So, the downfall of a tragic hero is usually caused by hamartia. And if you consider Greek tragedy, then you will find that Greek tragedy is predominantly a tragedy of fate, and that's why the tragic flaw is the thing that causes the downfall of a tragic hero. So, well, then after this portion, if we go to the chapter 24 and chapter 26, so just let us have a look on chapter 24. The name of the chapter 24 is epic poetry. So far Aristotle has concentrated on the discussion of tragedy. In chapter 5 he has referred the word epic, but so far, at least up to chapter 15, epic is not that much highlighted. But in chapter 24, the title of the chapter is Epic Poetry. And then in chapter 25 is Critical Objection and their answer. That means critical objection by the most critics of his time. And finally, chapter 26, the last chapter, is epic and tragedy compared. That means the comparison between epic and tragedy. Well, so Aristotle concludes his critical text, Poetics, by tackling the question of whether the epic or tragic form is higher. Higher means which one is superior. That means is epic superior or is tragedy superior? So, what was the opinion of the time? That means the opinion of Aristotelian time. Most critics of his time argued that tragedy was for an inferior audience that required the gesture of performer, while epic poetry was for a cultivated audience which could filter a narrative form through their own imagination. So, except Aristotle, the other general people or the other critics was or were in favor of epic. For them, epic is dignified, but tragedy was vulgar. But interestingly, our Aristotle disagreed. So Aristotle argues that tragedy is in fact superior to epic. Why? Because it has all the epic elements as well as spectacle and music to provide an indulgent pleasure for the audience. So these things are very important. The last portion, if therefore tragedy is superior to epic in all this respect and also in fulfilling its artistic function. For this form of art ought to give not just any kind of pleasure but the kinds I have described, then obviously in achieving its end better than epic it must be the better form of art. So we find that Aristotle was in favor of tragedy, and to him tragedy is better form of art. So dear students, now let us go to the core discussion. So what core terms in Aristotle Poetics do we find? Just think about from the chapter 1 to chapter 26. Then you get some major ideas. The first idea that we get from Aristotle Poetics is mimesis, or Aristotle's conception of mimesis. So we have already discussed what is mimesis, or imitation or representation. And in the conception of mimesis, we find three things: medium, then object, and manner of poetic imitation. Well, then we find poetic truth and historical truth. Just the very words poetic truth and historical truth gives us an idea. Let us quote from Poetics. It is not the poet's function to describe what has actually happened, but the kinds of things that might happen, that is, that could happen because they are in the circumstance, either probable or necessary. So Aristotle is in favor of poetic truth. Historical truth is the truth that occurred in history, but poetic truth is something that might happen either probably or for necessarily. So, poetic truth and historical truth are two important concepts in poetics. Well, then we find the concept of fear and pity, or you say pity and fear. So we know pity is for the tragic hero, for the downfall of the tragic hero, and fear is for the audience himself. Then comes catharsis, or purgation or purification. Catharsis is an emotion arising from the feelings of pity and fear. Okay, then the three very important terms: reversal, discovery, and calamity. We have already discussed. And finally, hamartia, or tragic flaw, or hubris. So, hamartia and hubris are basically Greek word. Hamartia is tragic flaw. That means the flaw of a tragic hero, for which the downfall of a tragic flaw occurs. Okay, and hubris is actually if the downfall of the tragic hero is caused for his pride, then it is hubris. Well, so hamartia, or tragic flaw, or hubris, or miscalculation or error of judgment, or you better say error in judgment. So these are the major ideas that we get in Aristotle's Poetics. So dear students, I do believe you will go through the original text. The text will give you an overall idea about Aristotle's conception of mimesis, Aristotle's idea of a tragedy, Aristotle's idea about the constituent parts of a tragedy, then poetic truth, or you better say historical truth, then Aristotle's idea about a tragic hero, then you will get the idea about reversal, then recognition or discovery, and calamity. And finally, you will be able to compare between epic and tragedy, and you will find that Aristotle was in favor of tragedy. So, dear students, that is all for today. I hope you will remain safe and sound. So, I would like to convey my thanks to you for your patient listening. So, Thank you, everybody. I do believe God obviously will help you. Thank you.